Welcome everybody, what a great evening, and I'm so thrilled and honored to be sitting up here with Elizabeth Gilbert. And well, let's get started.
Let's roll.
All right, can I start with an Olay?
Thank you.
Has everybody seen the TED Talk, right? Have you guys seen the TED Talk? All right, so one of the worries that Elizabeth had earlier on was whether her creative spirit would find her again. And I think after reading this book, certainly that happened.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It was beautiful.
I appreciate it, Trevor.
All right, so it's a long book and very dense, and I found it very satisfying. It was like a yummy, delicious, long dinner, and I felt very full at the end. So how long did it take you to research this book? It's so dense.
Yeah, it took, I have a friend who said it's like eating one of those croissants that's so light and flaky you don't realize that it has 3 sticks of butter in it.
Exactly.
That's what I'm hoping it comes across in the book. It took me about 3 years to research it, which included researching the history of botany in the late 18th, early 19th century, abolition, missionary life, pornography of the era, which was very important to the book, thank goodness.
That was interesting, that part. I liked it.
All, you know, just every aspect that I possibly could of that era, and then traveling to Kew Gardens in London to look at Darwin's herbarium, to go to the Hortus Botanical Gardens in Amsterdam, one of the early pharmaceutical gardens in the world, and of course to French Polynesia to make sure that the Tahitian part of the book was right, because, you know, that's the sacrifice we make for our art.
Yes, that's very difficult to go
it is.
to such
Thank
tough
you for
places.
your sympathy.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well, okay, so, you know, one of the things that I was impressed about this book was the depth of Alma, and she was such a fascinating character. She's not your average heroine by any means. How did she come to you?
You know, I knew I wanted to write about a woman. I knew I wanted to write about a scientist. I thought that would be an interesting creative encounter for me because I'm very much not a scientist. Alma is empirical, she's fact-driven, her world is black and white, she's always trying to hunt down the code behind everything. I am spiritual, flaky, slipshod, airy, I'm everything that she isn't. So, so it was kind of cool to step into her very sensible shoes and become a person with a very different mind than my own. And as it turned out, botany was really the only plausible science that I could place her in the 19th century because botany was the only science that women were sort of welcomed into on account of flowers, women, feminine. And so there were a number of really interesting 19th century botanists whose lives I drew upon to create Alma. What I discovered when I researched them, it's a broad generality, but it kind of works for our subject here, is that they tended to share 3 characteristics in common, the actual prominent female botanists of the day. They were either the daughters or the wives of significant men of science. They tended to be independently wealthy, and they tended to be either spinsters or childless. And so it was out of that model that Alma started to be formed, a woman who is all 3 of those things.
Now, did you have to wrestle with her, or did she come naturally? Was this a genius moment and where you felt comfortable with her?
You know, I don't wrestle with anybody. You know, I'm not a fighter, and I think I don't even fight with my work. I wouldn't even wrestle with a mugger, probably. You know, like I'm a cooperator. You know, I would just be like, what is it that, you know, what are we? Let's talk about this. You know,
let's get this down, Alma.
Surely we can come to some kind of a compromise here. And I spend a lot of time. You know, my feeling generally in life is that anything that you fight fights you back. And so I don't fight against creativity. I try to work with it. I think it's a really beautiful collaboration. I think ultimately my definition of creativity is that it's a collaboration between a human being and the mystery of inspiration. And the mystery of inspiration we will never solve. And it's also very rare. You know, inspiration to me is kind of like the creative equivalent of infatuation. It's sexy, and it's fleeting, and it's magnificent, and we all want to live in that all the time. For me, the difference between inspiration and a lifetime of creativity is like the difference between a one-night stand and a 30-year marriage. You know,
I love that.
And so my job as somebody who wants to be married to creativity is to show up every day and do the daily work, you know, and to celebrate the daily work, not as boring, but as devotional. You know, so Alma, I mostly just asked her questions, you know, and I would say to her, what do you want people to know about you? What do you want, lead me, where do you want me to take this story? What, you know, what do you want us to do here? And somehow that seems to work better for me than fighting.
Well, I felt while I was reading it that you really had high regard for her, that you really cared about her, and that you really connected with her. Is there parts of Alma in you?
Well, sure, but there's parts of me in every character in this book because I wrote it, so my DNA is embedded in everybody. You know, so there's parts of Alma. I mean, there's certainly very big differences between me and Alma as well. You know, primary of which I think is that I'm a very social creature, and she never quite mastered that. You know, she's got a sort of awkwardness around people that I've never had, and of course her science mind versus my arty mind. But what we share, I think, is a devotion toward a vocation. And I feel like one of the things I really wanted this novel to be is the celebration of a woman who loves her work, who loves her vocation, because I feel like that's a story we just don't see told very often, and we don't see honored very often. And as a woman whose life has been like really created by my work and then oftentimes saved by my work, I have such regard for the idea that you find something to do that you love and you commit yourself to it for your entire life. And that's where she and I are kind of soul twins. Although she would hate the word soul twins.
She would, it's not scientific enough. Not enough. All right, well, so I was going to ask you which character was the most difficult, but since it feels like it sort of they come to you in this nice non-wrestling way, is that a pertinent question?
You know, it's funny. They, the character who I felt like I didn't know when I began writing the book, because I felt like I spent so much time. I mean, the other thing I should tell you is that I'm a real worker, and when we talk about creative inspiration, I want to make very clear that I have high regard for it, and I think it's exciting and I think it's important. But I'm much more really of the Thomas Edison school of 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. You know,
you work hard.
I work really hard, and I work really diligently, and the inspiration comes through the cracks in that work. You know, and so by the time I sat down to write this book, I had 5 shoeboxes filled with index cards of notes from 3 years of research. I had a 70-page long outline. I knew who every character was. I knew every plot point. It was really, I left very little to chance. That said, there was this one character, the missionary, the Reverend Francis Wells. That was tricky for me because I wanted him to be a very sympathetic character, and yet it's difficult to read the history of the Christian missions of the 19th century and not sort of be like, guys, stop, you know.
I did. I felt terrible for
their culture. Stop telling those children they're not allowed to speak their native tongue. You know, like all, you know, you're watching them do all this stuff, and even though they were doing it from the goodness of their hearts, they were doing a lot of damage often when they went places.
That was clear.
So it was tricky for me to find out how to make him both plausible as a missionary, but also very deeply lovable as a person. So that was a little bit of effort. And so
I think you accomplished it.
Well, thanks.
I just connected to him. I thought he was a lovely person, and he meant well, as best he could.
As he said himself, my wife says I'm a better Christian than I am a missionary. I just had him be really bad at converting people, and really good at loving them. And so I wanted him to be sort of the Christian heart of the book in the way that I could respect and regard.
Now, I just had to imagine halfway through this book that you became obsessed with moss.
I did, and I hope the readers will too. It's worthy of obsession. You know, moss did not get to be the oldest plant on Earth by being stupid and boring. You know, so, it's a really interesting substance, and I wanted Alma to study moss because I needed her to have something that she could realistically devote her life to that was within walking distance of her house, and that was also varied enough that she wouldn't have to go to Madagascar or to the Galapagos like the great male explorers of the day in order to investigate it. Something, and I also felt like there was something symbolic about the fact that moss is overlooked and underfoot, and that is, I think, what many women's lives have been.
Exactly.
And also that it's tiny and detailed, like the arts that women have always done. It's kind of like the needlework of the botanical world. The things that women have always made in order to not go mad. And moss was what Alma studied in order to not go mad.
Well, just thinking about what she did to study moss, which went years and years, 50, 60 years. So there's a theme of time in the book. Can you tell us about time? Because there's different types of time.
Yeah, Alma falls into this theory of these different sorts of time, and I've always been sort of interested in this as well. That, and she talks about, it begins for her with geological time. You know, she's a scientist, and at that moment in history, fossils were being discovered, and there was a dawning realization that the oceans and the land masses were not in the same place they had always been. People were trying to work that out, and there was this sort of growing revelation that the Earth was a good deal older than we had thought it was. Maybe even a fantastically amount older than we thought it was. So she's sort of focused on this idea of very slow geological time. And then the deepest time is what she calls divine time, which is the time that God lives in, which is a kind of eternal stasis that is unknowable to a human being. She has no interest in studying it because she doesn't believe it can be cracked. But she knows it's out there, right? And that's like the slowest time there is. And then there's geological time. And then there's moss time. And moss time is the amount of time it takes a bed of moss to transform the environment that it's in. Moss very slowly eats rock and breaks it down. And so moss time is faster than geological time. Moss can do in 1,000 years what stone can't do in 10,000, 100,000 years. But it's still achingly slow. And then at the very bottom of the level is the thing she calls human time. And human time is the snap of the finger that's a human life. And she becomes keenly aware of this in her middle age because she knows she doesn't have enough years to study the moss that she wants to understand and the geology that she wants to understand. And she envies the moss, their pace. And she says, if they knew how short my time was here, they would be so sad for me. That she only has a few decades to try to capture their movement and their evolution. And there's a sort of pain that I've always felt about that as well. I've always been, even as a child, I think I've always been keenly aware of how short our time is here, and probably why I am so stressfully trying to achieve as much as I possibly can in that time, rather than just enjoying it, which is what other people might tell me to do.
This is all good, though, because you're creating beautiful things, and we get to learn from these things, too. And I've learned a lot about moss just reading this book, so.
It is a 500-page novel about moss. It's not really only about that. Don't worry, guys.
You've got to read it.
Goes down easy. Goes down real easy.
And of course,
buttered croissant. Buttered croissant.
Yeah. So, and then there's of course the huge tension between evolution and Darwinism, which he is in sort of lockstep with Darwin, coming up with the theory, but also with human connection and self-sacrifice, or the prudence problem. Tell us about that.
Well, one of the things that Alma. One of the things I should back up and say that I found it fascinating and educational to learn that the word evolution and the idea of evolution had been around for a good 70 years before Darwin ever wrote Origin of Species. I did not know that. I thought that evolution got dropped like a sort of spilled meal in front of everybody as soon as Darwin published. But everybody who was anybody in the scientific world all through the 19th century had been pondering this question and this puzzle. They knew that species were transmuting. They knew that the geological record showed that the world was older than they thought. They knew that things were changing. They just didn't know the mechanism. And what Darwin did was he brought forth the mechanism. And that is the theory of competitive alteration and survival of the fittest. And Alma's working on that too, as are a bunch of other people. So she's working on that question from the moss fields. And she's gleaning the same conclusions. She's kind of circling the same idea, that there seems to be this process by which there are limited resources in too many organisms. And the ones that make it, and the species that make it, are the ones that can sort of get to those resources. All of which points to the idea of tremendous competition and even violence in the world.
Yes.
And in that theory, she simply cannot solve the question of how you then account for human altruism and self-sacrifice. And she holds back a lot of her writings on this because she can't solve that question. And she's such a perfectionist that she wants to make sure that she gets that right. And it's a question that still hasn't been solved. We still don't have universal scientific explanation for why somebody would give their life to another person before they had even passed on their genetic code. You know, that doesn't make sense in the evolutionary standpoint. And so there's this little crack in the theory that we still haven't quite mastered.
Well, I do address that in my book, and just to put a quick plug in, but I do believe it's survival. November.
Available in all fine bookstores.
Right. But the survival of the most connected, I actually believe, that we really cannot live alone in. just eat each other up.
It's funny you should say that, because I spoke, I did a lot of research with a very prominent female moss scientist who's kind of a rock star hero of mine. It took me 2 years to get up the nerve to write her a letter to ask if I could come and visit her. And I like inflated her in my mind to such an, I thought she was like Bono at that point, and I thought she was going to be like when I went to her farmhouse in upstate New York, and I thought there must be lines of people here wanting to visit Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer and talk to her about moss evolution, you know, because she just had become so huge in my mind. But she spoke about how, you know, moss, there is really no such thing as a moss. You know, one moss is a dead moss. It's a colony, and she talks about the ways that even there's altruism within the moss community, where she has studied how a certain group of mosses will sacrifice themselves on the edges and the perimeter so that the interior of the colony can get water. You know, so even there in the natural world, you know, without collaboration, we don't last long.
Nobody does. I agree. There you go. So another of the themes is this sort of communication across time and space, emotionally, spiritually. And of course, we have Ambrose Pike and Alma. And they communicate, but maybe miscommunicate a little bit.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Well, Alma is a very rational and grounded person who does what all rational, grounded people do. She falls in love with the first magnetic, artistic, irrational, airy person that she meets. I'm sure that that's never happened to anybody in this audience. There is nothing more attractive than somebody whose feet do not touch the ground. And Alma falls prey to that. And he is not he's a lovely person. His name is Ambrose Pike, and he's a painter of orchids, and a beautiful man, and a transcendental soul who really doesn't want to be a person. He wants to be a spirit. And very much believes in spiritual communication. And something occurs between them at some point in the novel, which I will always leave to the reader to decide what exactly that was. But in that moment, they both believe that they have heard something. They have misheard. And I think it's...
They connected.
They connected, but I think that that's one of the great sort of tragedies and trials of human love, is that sometimes even in those moments of greatest perceived intimacy, we can be so wrong about what's going on in the other person's mind. Just so terribly, terribly wrong. And neither one of them had ever been particularly taught how to transcend that. And so they were relying on kind of signals and notions rather than on anything more solid and real.
Well, it did feel very believable to me. I mean, just imagining how people spoke in the Victorian times, early Victorian times, really, and how they would communicate and how you would talk about love without having really any language. So in a way, it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, and forget about language about sex.
Right.
You know, and I mean, this was an era. It was the other thing I found very interesting was my character is very sexual, and I wanted her to be, because I wanted to tell the entire life of a woman, birth to death, and that includes sexuality. And I wanted that, and because I'm a contemporary writer, although it feels like a 19th century book, I'm writing from a contemporary standpoint, so I can do what the Brontes could only insinuate.
Imagine.
You know, and I can sort of express what they could only sort of wink at. And I wanted to really fully investigate that, because I also think that having read our proper Jane Austen for so many years, we do forget that these people had bodies. They weren't just heads on top of corseted dresses, you know? They had, and we did not invent sexual desire in the 20th century as much as we like to think that we did. It's not new, and so I wanted to explore that with Alma. But she was at a tough moment for that. Her father was a creature from the era of the Age of Enlightenment, which was a much more sexually open era than what came after it. And it was really interesting for me to see how in the late 1780s, there was this idea that people like each other's bodies. I mean, if you read Ben Franklin, he's a randy guy, and his assumption is that women are too. Yeah. You know, and he's really comfortable with the fact that women are into this and I'm into this, and you know, like, let's check this out. I mean, he lived in France a long time too, so that helped. You know, but you know, he had sort of progressive ideas, but that was not atypical of the time. And then you go 100 years later, 75 years later, and everything has been locked down. And there's not only this idea that this must never be spoken of, it must never be written of, it must never be admitted to. There was also this new idea that women hated it. And you see these heartbreaking letters that young Victorian men wrote to their brides-to-be, these like tear-stained letters saying, "I'm so sorry in advance for the horror that I'm about to inflict on you."
Dear.
You know, because the assumption was they really hate it. You know, it's awful for them. And so to be a woman in that time who was like, "I'm kind of interested in this," would have been a really difficult thing to be. And I wanted to sort of set Alma in contrast to that and see how she was going to manage that.
Although, and this is a spoiler alert, so if anybody hasn't fully read the book,
just go la la la.
Cover your ears. So she didn't really get very much action.
No, action is a very 19th century term, Trevor. She doesn't.
I kind of felt badly for her, and I was sort of hoping, you know,
I know,
she would get a little.
I know. Well, she got a little something, but we're not gonna go too far into that. No, and the reason for that is because I wanted to write a very realistic story, and sometimes people don't get everything they want, you know, and I feel like I wanted to push very hard also in this novel against the only two endings that women ever got in 19th century novels, and in most contemporary stories too, may I say, which is you have the happy ending, which is that you're married to Mr. Darcy and you're living on a grand estate, or you know, or marriage, you know, good marriage.
There's a white horse in there too.
There's some guy shows up and it's great. Or you have the tragic ending and you're under the wheels of the train like poor Anna Karenina, right? You're ruined. You know, and there are lots of examples of both of those. And I get it because they're both very dramatic endings. One is you know, even in Shakespeare, there's always, the comic endings always end in marriage, the tragic endings always end in death. And generally speaking though, when it comes to women's lives, it seems like the plot line you get is that you were either rescued by a man or you were ruined by a man. And the reality of women's lives then and now is a lot more complicated than that. And I think that most of us have had moments where we thought, hoped, dreamed that we were being rescued by a man, and maybe it didn't quite turn out. And most of us have had very dark moments where we feared, dreaded that we were going to be ruined by a man, and maybe that didn't quite turn out either, right? Most of us live in the wide medium, which is that you probably didn't necessarily get everything you wanted, but you probably along the way got a lot of things that you did not expect. And certainly the women who I admire and who I base my life on and who I based Alma's life on are women who have a tremendous capacity for being resilient in the face of disappointment. I find that to be the most interesting thing about women, and that they are neither rescued nor ruined. They manage somehow in the midst of their lives to create their own reality, and they are able, after the end of a very long life that's filled with both love and disappointment, and pain and joy, to look back and say, that was a really interesting thing being alive, you know? Glad I did that, you know, like, cool, you know, like, and that's how I feel about Alma, is that by the end of the novel, she's able to look back on this very long life, and we've been with her through every step of it, and she's able to say, that was fantastically interesting. And I think interesting is what you strive for ultimately, above all.
I love that. Interesting women. So how has your love life affected your writing?
Well,
just to put it out there.
Well, it's certainly affected Eat, Pray, Love, as anybody who's got $10 to buy that paperback can attest. It affected it negatively and positively. I mean, it shaped all of it. And you know, I spent a lot of my life chasing the boys, and they show up in all kinds of ways in my writing. This novel has a very special tone to it, I think, because of something that occurred. I am married to Javier Bardem. You guys know that, right?
I knew that.
And we live in New Jersey, which is where you would live if you could live anywhere, right? I did get my Brazilian guy to leave Bali and move to Jersey. Yes! And it's a very happy marriage. It's a very sweet marriage. And and very lovely, and we're very grateful. We spend a lot of time just being grateful, having been through things that are not sweet and easy. This is nice. We're like, this is good, you know? And I tend to be, when I'm writing, I tend to need quite a bit of isolation, and I've never been able to write in my home, whatever my home may have been. I've always had to go out, whether it was to a public private space like a library, to an artist retreat, just have to go away. And this novel I wrote at home. It was the first book I ever wrote at home.
Nice.
And not only did I write it at home, but every evening my husband would come upstairs with a glass of wine, and he would listen to me read what I had written that day. And it started kind of accidentally. I finished the introduction, I said, "You want to hear this?" And he came up and I read it to him, and he said, "What happens? What happens?" So the next night he came up and I read him the next piece, and I wrote it in one, you know, I never stopped once I started. So it was as though I were writing a Victorian serialized novel, but I was writing it for one person, and I was writing it every day, so that I would always leave off at the end of a moment in the book, and then he would say, well, what? So I had that sense as I was writing that I need to bring him the story tomorrow. And so while I was writing, I was delighting him also, which I hope is in the feeling of the book. And it also keeps the book going, because while I was reading it to him, if I saw, he's so loving and polite, but if I saw the eyes glaze over, I would like in the margin, I'd be like, cut this page, you know, like cut this page. Like I could just see where I was losing him as a reader, you know, so it keeps, that's why it's not a 1,500-page book, it's only a 500-page. So you all have him to thank for that.
You can feel that loving collaboration come throughout the book. It really feels good.
I hope so.
Reading that book. And it is such it's just a huge shift from Eat, Pray, Love. And do you feel good about that?
I feel great about that, at the same time as not ever, ever wanting to turn my back on Eat, Pray, Love. You know, I've read some reviews. It's very funny to me, like the approval and disapproval matrix in the literary world. You know, like I was really on the good side for a long time when I was beginning my writing career, and I wrote literary fiction. My first book was a collection of short stories, and then a novel, and they gave me the National Book Award nomination for my big biography about a man's journey. And then my next book I wrote was about a woman's journey, and then they just dumped me into the chick lit, that they were like, oh, you know, how could you possibly write about emotional life and spirituality and self-improvement and all that stuff? Like I really disappointed them. Like that's the feeling. I cannot express how little I care, first of all, but I, you know, it's amusing for me to watch. It's amusing for me to watch me go from like, you know, we approve of you, to, oh, honey, no, you can't talk about that. And then I came back with this novel, and to read the reviews, I just go, you guys think I did this for you, you know, because they're so approving again now. They're like, oh, thank goodness she's put all that behind her, and now she's writing serious literature again. And I'm like, if you guys think I've put any of that behind me, you are so out of your minds, because I am so still on that flaky train, man. I am like, you know, I am so still all up in that stuff. And if you come to my Facebook page, you're gonna hate me all over again, because I'm like all about like empowerment and transformation and, you know, all of this stuff. And so I'll read, like there was a review on NPR the other day, and it was so loving at the same time as like a lot of reviews the person needed, I guess, out of, I don't know, their own fear or whatever, to make clear that don't worry, I can't stand Eat, Pray, Love Elizabeth Gilbert, but you will love this book because it's actually a really good book. You know, and I just thought, why do you even have to do that? And also, don't you have other parts of you? You know, like, aren't you made up of many things, like all of us? And don't, you know, and this is the part of me who wants to write novels like this. But the other part of me is still very, very much there. And actually sneaks into this novel in a lot of ways.
The flaky one?
Yeah.
Really?
I'm far more Ambrose than I am Alma. You know, so I'm in there, you know, like I'm in there in other ways too. So I just find it so funny, like what you're allowed to talk about and what you're not allowed to talk about. I'm just going to talk about whatever I feel like talking about, basically.
So have you started thinking about our next project?
Yeah, I'm always thinking about it, and it's funny. There's two that are in my mind, and they're sort of having a ping pong match. And that ping pong match has been going on for about 6 months, and I'm watching I'm watching it. And it's not time for me to write yet. It's time for me to, this is my moment for bringing Alma into the world and for doing this sort of thing. But I know that, you know, in about 6 months, it'll be time for me to start. And then I'm going to have a little talking to with them. You know, I end up talking a lot to my work. So I'm just going to have to say to them, you guys have to decide which one of you is coming first. Is it the novel or is it the nonfiction book? You're going to have to work this out among yourselves.
Now, is this the corner of the room that you mentioned in the TED Talk? You have to go to that corner and say, all right.
Guys, you know, like, and I'm not going to settle this for you. That's what I tell them all the time. It's sort of parental also. The one of you who wants to be born first is going to have to really step up, or the one of you who's willing to wait is going to have to back off. But I'm only doing one at a time.
So going back to you, are we feeling that, you know, sort of tough place of the creative genius and feeling upset or worried or depressed or anything? Because you don't appear to be. It doesn't seem like you're wrestling with that. You look pretty happy and comfortable.
Pretty happy, pretty comfortable.
Good.
You know, I mean, I'll tell you this. I feel like I will always be, what's the word that I am? I will always be fundamentalist on this. I will always be challenging the idea that we must be at war with our work. I will always be challenging that. And I challenge that because I've struggled with work and I've cooperated with work and I've seen which way works better. And I also really, truly have come to believe that the world is, and this is the stuff that the New York Times writers who like me right now don't want to hear me saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, that the world is constantly being enswirled and encircled by creative ideas that want to be made manifest. And the only way they can be made manifest is through collaboration with a human being. So they send you these little jolts of inspiration. They throw curious little coincidences in front of you. They try to get your attention. They ask you, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Are you my mother? You know, they want to know if you're going to make them be born. And when you choose to accept those invitations, then you have a commitment to honor that, you know, and to show up for it. Creative ideas have nothing to gain by tormenting you. They only want to be born. They are, I guarantee you, they are trying to help you. They really are. They're trying to help you make them come through. If there are obstacles, if there are torments, if there are dark nights of the soul, that's you. That's not it, right? And what I feel like happens when we do our thrashing dark night of the soul in the artist studio is that the creative idea is just sitting on the cot in the corner watching like, just let me know when you're done with that. Because when you're done with that thing that you're doing, then we can get back to work, you know? But that whole thing, I can't do anything with you when you're like that, you know? And it just waits. And so I feel like when tormented artists like sort of believe that their work comes through the torment, I'm like, no, it comes despite the torment. You know, it's the grass that grows up in the cracks of that cement sidewalk, and that cement is your torment. It's just looking for the angle in,
to come in.
You know? And so once I chose to believe that, there's nothing to be afraid of, except for my own garbage, which I've learned how to identify as being my own. So then I'll apologize. I'll be like, listen, work, sorry, I'm having a little panic, but I know it's got nothing to do with you. And it's like, have at it, you know? When you're done freaking out, let's get back to it, you know? And that seems to work the best way for me.
I'm so glad to hear that. Because we want our artists alive. We don't want them tormented, right? We want them to be able to be productive and make these beautiful babies, right?
Yeah, so. I for one would love some more Dylan Thomas poems. I for one would love another Hemingway novel. I for one really miss the artists who took themselves out of the world too soon, because there's a hole in the world from the work they never made. And you know, there's a hole in the world from all the work that we never make. You know, and I feel like we need to start filling those holes with beauty, beauty, beauty as much as we can, because that's our highest calling, I think.
That's wonderful.